Hello, public opinion aficionados, and welcome to the Rasmussen Reports channel, where we provide high-priced research to corporations like those in the movie industry. At least we would if they'd listen to us, but it appears that they've been ignoring the research. And this is a great day to talk about this topic, since it's the day that the high-profile proxy battle going on with Disney is going to have its votes revealed. Now, if you've followed mainstream media news, the term reimagining for a modern audience might be familiar to you. But if these modern audiences are so great, shouldn't we be able to pick up a signal in our polling? Well, we tried, and it turns out that people overwhelmingly prefer older movies. And although we're not trying to pick on Disney individually here, make sure you stick around to the rest of the video if you want to see our polling on Disney as well. And here's what we asked. Are movies today better than they were just 10 years ago? And according to over 1,200 American adults, 22% or less than 1 in 4 said yes, but 58%, more than a 2-to-1 margin, said no. 20% weren't sure. But are movies today better than they were 20 years ago? And still 27%, just barely over 1 in 4 Americans say yes, but a majority, 54%, say no. And believe it or not, when asked, are movies better than they were 50 years ago? Still, only 37% of Americans say yes, but a plurality, 43%, say no. And just to be clear, that 50 years ago puts us back in the 70s. Of course, that's the same decade that the original Star Wars movie came out. Now, what's going on here? If I answered these questions, I certainly would have been a no. Almost all of my favorite movies, with a few exceptions, came out at least 20 years ago. And if I had to propose a theory, just looking at these numbers, I think nostalgia would be a really big part of it. And although movies today do seem to try to be cashing in on that nostalgia, there seems to be just something missing. But who are the people that like modern movies better? It turns out it really isn't anybody. There's hardly any gender signal. Believe it or not, men and women are equally about as likely to agree on this topic. The numbers were so close that they're not even worth putting up. But here's a really interesting look at age, and I tried to get it all on one slide. And let's start with older Americans. Now, the 65 and older crew were pretty much alive when all this entertainment came out, so it's understandable they'd prefer older movies to newer ones. And they overwhelmingly do by a 52% to 16% margin for movies 10 years ago, by a 63% to 13% margin for 20 years ago, but a weaker 54% to 20% margin for movies that came out over 50 years ago. So although they have rose-colored glasses for the past, it seems like there's a bit of a sweet spot at that 20-year mark. But let's look at younger Americans, that 18 to 39-year-old column. And a majority of them actually prefer modern movies to movies made 50 years ago. And maybe that isn't surprising, but what's surprising to me is how small that margin is. It's only a 54% to 33% margin. A majority of younger Americans also prefer modern movies to movies made 20 years ago, but it's only by 1 point, roughly split at 45% to 44%. And again, like everybody else, a majority of 18 to 39-year-olds actually prefer movies made 10 years ago to movies made today. So there is agreement across all ages that things were just better not that long ago. What went wrong? Now, that 40 to 64-year-old column is really interesting. A strong majority of them agree that movies of any era are better than modern movies. But like the 18 to 39-year-olds, they agree that the sweet spot was about 10 years ago. 65% of them say modern movies aren't better than they were 10 years ago, and only 17% say yes, for an astounding almost 4-to-1 margin. Now, the race signal wasn't really strong enough to put on the screen either. Believe it or not, Hispanic or other race Americans are more likely by a few points than anybody else to respect older cinema. But here are the party numbers, and they're pretty incredible. I mean, we're talking about a pretty non-political question about pop culture. For something different in the psyches of Democrats versus Republicans to drive a difference like this, there's something pretty important going on. And to be honest, it's the Democrats that stick out like a sore thumb. They're much more likely than anyone else to prefer modern movies to older movies. But still, even with them, it isn't by much. Modern movies only lead 50-year-old movies by a little bit more than 7% among Democrats. But a plurality of Democrats still prefer movies made 20 and 10 years ago than they do to movies made today. But look at those Republican and independent columns. They overwhelmingly prefer older movies of every era to modern movies. But again, there's that sweet spot that seemed to happen about 10 years ago. Post your thoughts in the comments about what change in entertainment happened, I don't know, let's say 2013 to 2015. Movies from that era are overwhelmingly viewed by all Americans as best. Now, again, I wasn't trying to pick on Disney, but they do have a pretty salient example of movies made, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and almost 50 years ago that we can use as a benchmark to compare how entertainment's been changing. Now, we asked this a little over a year ago. Are the new Star Wars movies made by Disney better or worse than the original Star Wars movies? Only 22% of Americans said better, but 31% said worse. Now, that is a negative signal, but based on my personal viewings of those movies, I kind of expected it to be bigger. But as an explainer, looking at the age numbers, you're starting to see what's driving the signal. And the 18 to 39-year-old people who weren't around for the social phenomenon of the original trilogy just didn't really understand. And they thought the modern movies were kind of okay. 41% said better, and only 24% said worse. But everybody else overwhelmingly agreed that the new Star Wars movies were way worse than the original trilogy. And just so you know, obviously, the no difference and not sure responses were probably largely people that just don't care about Star Wars or didn't watch the movies. But that 40 to 64-year-old row really has to sting for Disney. That's the group that arguably controls the most per capita consumer discretionary spending. And by over a 3-to-1 margin, they say the older Star Wars movies were better than the new ones. And the signal held up for Marvel movies, which we also asked about. Overall, America was kind of split on whether the new ones were better than the old ones. 25% say better, 27% said worse. And it's a little bit of a tricky question because there weren't really, 30, 40, 50-year-old Marvel movies to go by. But again, there was the same signal with younger people, 18 to 39-year-olds, saying that the newer movies were better by a 2-to-1 margin, and everybody else strongly disagreeing. But let's take a moment to pause and think about the why. I'd love your thoughts in the comments of questions we could ask to get at this trend about why things were just better not that long ago. We took a stab at it 2 years ago when Disney made some headlines. The president of Disney General Entertainment recently said that Disney has many LGBTQIA characters in our stories. Do you support or oppose this trend? And amongst all Americans, 42% supported it, but only 23% strongly. But 47% opposed, 34% strongly. A pretty negative signal. But look at the party results. Republicans were overwhelmingly opposed by 66% to 24%. But even though independents were roughly mixed from an opposed to support perspective, 35% of them strongly opposed and only 21% of them strongly supported it. But Democrats kind of seem to be all for it. 59% supported, maybe that number should have been bigger, but 30% opposed. So they're 2-to-1 in favor, but only 35% strongly supported it and 16% strongly opposed. Is the emphasis on inclusion and diversity by companies like Disney making children's entertainment better or worse? And again, America wasn't buying this. 28% of Americans said better, but 45% said worse. And again, there was a pretty strong party signal, but only 42% of Democrats said better, which is interesting because diversity, equity, inclusion is kind of perceived to be a left thing. But now that we're talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, don't miss out on our recent polling. Are DEI programs making products and entertainment better or worse? 22% of Americans say better, but 37% say worse. A pretty strong repudiation. And amongst Americans who are very familiar with these DEI programs, believe it or not, by almost a 2-to-1 margin, they say that DEI makes products and entertainment worse compared to better by a 56% to 30% margin. We actually covered this topic last week, so don't miss it. I'll link the video at the end of this one. And also, while you're at it, go to Breitbart and read the exclusive story that John Nolte, a close friend of Rasmussen Reports, wrote just today about the numbers covered in this video. If you'd like to see more numbers about pop culture, entertainment, and even video games, which we covered recently, please be sure to put your question ideas in the comments at YouTube. We always need new ways to come at these topics. And also, make sure you follow us if you don't want to miss our new Trump numbers coming out later this week. They're going to be newsworthy. So follow us at Twitter at Rasmussen_poll. Don't forget to subscribe to this video at YouTube or Rumble. Make sure you click like on the video. And thanks for watching.